At my daughter's wedding, her arrogant fiancé grabbed me by the back of the neck and slammed my face right into the three-tier wedding cake. He laughed into the microphone, shouting, "Have a taste of dessert, you beggar. Don't let anyone say I left my father-in-law hungry." The crowd gasped, but before I could even wipe the frosting from my eyes, the coldest real estate mogul on the East Coast jumped up from the VIP table, pointed a trembling finger at the groom, and roared, "Are you insane? That man is a billionaire." The fiancé's face turned ghostly white in an instant. He had no idea that just 3 hours earlier, I had quietly purchased every single one of his massive secret debts. If you want to see how a proud father breaks a con artist, tell me where you're watching this from in the comments and keep listening. I shifted the heavy manual transmission of my rusted 2005 Ford F-150. As I drove it up the steep, perfectly manicured driveway of a luxury Hampton estate, the beat-up engine let out its familiar, comforting rumble. My hands gripping the worn steering wheel were thick, weather-beaten, and covered in heavy calluses. These were the hands of a man who had spent 40 years building a global shipping and commercial real estate empire. I started from nothing, beginning on the icy docks of New York with a single rusted tugboat. My wealth wasn't inherited. I bled and sweated for every bit of it. I sacrificed my youth, my sleep, and eventually even my marriage, just to build a secure fortress for my family. Yet I never cared to show it off. I still drove my old truck. I still polished my own boots. Sitting on the cracked leather passenger seat next to me was a wedding invitation. It was printed on heavy, expensive cardstock with raised gold lettering. It was the wedding of my only child, my daughter Brooke. For the past 15 years, since my painful divorce from her mother, Patricia, our relationship had become incredibly distant. Patricia was a woman who loved status and the sparkle of high society far more than the man who worked day and night to provide it. When we split, she poisoned my daughter's mind, painting me as a work-obsessed machine who cared only for cargo ships and nothing for his family. Tucked inside that elegant, shimmering envelope was a small, yellow, sticky note. It wasn't a message of love or excitement from my daughter, but a rushed, scrawled note from Patricia. It read, "Try to dress appropriately, Harrison. Stand in the back." I parked my beat-up truck at the very edge of the lot, deliberately keeping it away from the main drive, tucked into the shadows between shimmering Porsches, imported Mercedes, and chauffeur-driven luxury SUVs. I killed the engine and let the silence wash over me for a moment. I stepped out of the truck, took a slow breath of the salty sea air, and straightened my lapels. This was a clean, pressed gray suit I'd bought at Sears 15 years ago. My boots were old steel-toed work boots. I kept them polished to a shine, but after years on ship decks, the toes were scarred and scuffed. They were comfortable, and more importantly, they kept me grounded. They reminded me of exactly who I was and where I came from. I walked slowly toward the grand entrance of the estate. Valet drivers in crisp white shirts were scrambling to open doors for women in designer gowns and men in tailored tuxedos. The display of wealth here was deafening, but to a man who truly has money, this loud, desperate showing always looks like a performance. As I approached the wide stone steps, a young man stepped directly into my path, blocking me completely. He wore an impeccably tailored navy suit that probably cost more than my first car. His hair was slicked back perfectly, and his posture radiated a completely unearned arrogance. This was Trent Caldwell, the man my daughter was about to marry. Since Patricia had kept me completely cut off from Brooke's adult life, I had never met him officially, but I recognized his face from the brief photos I'd seen online. Trent stopped and looked me up and down. His gaze swept over my outdated, simple suit and landed right on my worn work boots. A look of intense disgust washed over his face, as if I'd tracked mud into his private kingdom. He sneered and let out a short, mocking sigh. Without a single greeting or basic human courtesy, he reached into his pocket and shoved a set of keys with a heavy leather fob aggressively toward my chest. "Here, take the keys to my car," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Be careful with the clutch. It's worth more than your life. Make sure you park it right up front so all my guests can see it. I didn't reach out to take the keys. My hands stayed quietly at my sides. I stood tall, posture rigid, and looked him straight in the eyes. I let a heavy silence hang between us for a long time, watching the irritation build on his polished face as he realized I refused to obey his command. "I'm not a valet," I said. My voice was calm, low, and steady, carrying the weight of a man who regularly negotiated with ruthless union bosses and international tycoons. "My name is Harrison Cole. I'm Brooke's father." The keys slid from his outstretched hand and hit the stone driveway with a sharp clatter. For a split second, the arrogant sneer on Trent's face completely vanished. He blinked, clearly caught off guard, staring at me like I was a stray dog that had somehow wandered into the palace. But that shock didn't last long. Within seconds, that fake polished smile returned, though it was stiff, forced, and completely devoid of any real warmth. "Right," he chuckled nervously, quickly bending down to grab his keys from the cold stone. "Brooke mentioned you might actually show up. I just didn't expect you to look so authentic." He didn't offer a handshake. He didn't say it was a pleasure to meet the man who gave life to his future bride. Instead, he turned his head and snapped his fingers loudly at a security guard standing by the heavy wooden doors. The guard hurried over, looking nervous. "Keep an eye on this old man," Trent ordered, not even bothering to lower his voice to spare my feelings. "Make sure he doesn't slip into the VIP lounge or bother the catering staff for free food. We have some very important, very wealthy investors arriving any minute, and we can't afford any embarrassing interruptions." The guard nodded, giving me a tired, apologetic look. Trent turned his back on me entirely and walked away to greet a group of wealthy-looking guests, laughing loudly and slapping them on the back as if I didn't exist. I stood on the steps, the cold sea air hitting my face. I didn't shout. I didn't cause a scene. I just watched him walk away. My gut told me everything I needed to know during that brief exchange. A man who shows such contempt for a stranger simply because he thinks they have no money is a man hiding a very dark, very fragile reality behind his expensive suit. I reached into my pocket and touched the smooth surface of my encrypted satellite phone. The wedding weekend had only just begun, but I already knew that Trent Caldwell had made the biggest mistake of his life. The game was on. The grand dining hall of the estate was a masterclass in aggressive luxury. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over tables draped in imported silk. Exquisite floral centerpieces towered over guests, dripping with rare orchids that cost more than a family's monthly grocery bill. A string quartet played softly in the corner, providing a sophisticated backdrop for the clinking of champagne flutes and the self-congratulatory laughter of the coastal elite. It was exactly the kind of hollow, dramatic display of wealth that Patricia had always craved. I found my assigned seat. It was a wobbly little chair, tucked away in the furthest corner of the cavernous room, directly next to the swinging metal doors of the kitchen. Every few minutes, a waiter would burst through those doors, bringing a wave of heat and the clatter of dishes. I had been placed as far away from Brooke and the main wedding party as possible. They had intentionally put me in the shadows, hoping I would be invisible to everyone. It was a calculated insult designed to make me feel completely unwelcome. I pulled out the chair, sat down quietly, and placed my calloused hands on my knees. I didn't complain to the staff. A man who truly knows his own worth never needs to demand a seat in the center of the room. I watched the elite guests socialize. To them, I was just an old man in an outdated suit and scuffed boots, an unfortunate smudge on a perfect aesthetic canvas. Soon, Trent's family made a grand entrance. They took their seats at the main table, but before they did, they took a deliberate detour right past my dark corner. Trent's mother, dripping in ostentatious jewelry, glanced at my boots and let out a sharp gasp. She leaned toward her sister and whispered loudly, "Can you believe he actually wore those ugly work boots to a formal dinner? It's simply shameful." "Trent is being incredibly merciful just to let that kind of ruffian in the building," the sister replied. "They talked about me as if I were deaf, or so insignificant that I couldn't possibly understand their cruelty." I felt a familiar, steady calm settle over my mind. In my 40 years of building a global logistics empire from nothing, I had faced down ruthless cartel bosses and survived. The petty, small-minded barbs of these overprotected socialites meant absolutely nothing to me. I took a slow sip of water. Fools always laugh the loudest before the ground beneath them gives way. My ex-wife, Patricia, walked across the room toward me. She was wearing a sleek designer gown, her face frozen in a polite smile. But as she neared my table, that smile vanished, replaced by a cold, rigid glare. She stopped by my chair, her posture stiff with years of held-back resentment. "I told you to stand in the back, Harrison," she said, her voice dropping to a vicious whisper. "But you just had to walk in and ruin the aesthetic. You look like a vagrant who wandered in off the street. I'm only here for my daughter's sake." Before I could respond, she reached into her expensive silver clutch. She pulled out a crisp, folded $100 bill. With an aggressive motion, she shoved the money firmly into the chest pocket of my old Sears suit. She patted the pocket twice, a condescending gesture that made my jaw tighten. "Take this," she whispered maliciously. "Use it to buy some gas and head back to whatever trailer park you're living in. Leave first thing tomorrow. We don't need your poverty ruining the wedding photos." She turned on her heel and strode back into the bright lights. She was expecting me to throw a fit, so she would have a reason to have me removed entirely. I didn't give her the satisfaction. I calmly reached into my pocket and pulled out the folded bill. I smoothed out the sharp creases on the table. Just then, a young busboy rushed out from the swinging kitchen doors. He couldn't have been more than 19, carrying a massive tray of dirty dishes that made his arms tremble under the weight. He looked exhausted and overwhelmed, while the wealthy guests laughing around him ignored him completely. I remembered how that boy felt. I remembered the days working double shifts on the icy shipping docks of New York Harbor. My hands bled just to have enough money to keep the heat on. In those days, a single bill could be the difference between eating and going hungry. True wealth isn't in an offshore bank account. True wealth is knowing the painful value of hard work. I never forgot where I came from. As the young busboy hurried past my table, I quietly slid that crisp $100 bill directly under the edge of his tray. He stopped in his tracks, looking at the money in complete shock. He looked up at me, his eyes full of gratitude. I just gave him a slight nod and put a finger to my lips. He mouthed a silent, "Thank you," and hurried back into the chaotic kitchen. With that handled, I turned my attention back to the center of the room. Trent was holding court at the main table, completely surrounded by an adoring audience. He was putting on the performance of his life. He gestured aggressively at the service staff, demanding they bring over 3 more bottles of vintage champagne. Those bottles cost $1,000 apiece. He poured the drinks casually, laughing loudly, playing the role of the carefree, untouchable billionaire hedge fund manager to perfection. But a man who has spent decades analyzing human behavior can always see what the average person misses. I watched Trent very carefully. My eyes tracked his every move, stripping away the shiny, expensive armor of his performance. The headwaiter walked toward Trent from behind, bent down, and cautiously handed over a leather-bound bill folder containing the preliminary costs for the rehearsal dinner. Trent kept up a bright, arrogant smile for his audience, but when he opened that leather booklet and glanced at the final total, I saw it. It was a micro-reaction, but to my trained eyes, it rang as loud as a gunshot. The muscles in Trent's jawline tightened violently. The color drained slightly from his cheeks. His hand trembled by a fraction, and he gripped his glass tighter to hide it. He shot a rapid, panicked glance around the room, his eyes darting like a trapped animal, desperate for an exit. He quickly scribbled a signature on the receipt, shoved the folder back at the waiter with a bit too much force, and forced his fake smile back into place a second too late. I leaned back comfortably in the wobbly chair by the kitchen door, the deafening roar of the high-end party fading into the background. My gut was screaming, loud, sharp, and undeniable. The performative extravagance, the aggressive arrogance masking a hollow reality, and the sheer terror in his eyes over a routine dinner bill. This boy wasn't a billionaire. He was drowning, and my only daughter was about to permanently lash herself to his sinking ship. I waited until Trent was distracted by a group of fawning bridesmaids before I finally made my move. I stood up, navigating through the sea of silk gowns and tailored tuxedos. I found Brooke standing near an imposing arrangement of white orchids. She looked stunning in her elegant gown, but there was a subtle tension in her shoulders, a stiffness that didn't belong to a bride on the eve of her wedding. I approached her slowly, my heavy boots making soft thuds on the polished hardwood. When she saw me, she grew even more rigid. She cast a quick, nervous glance over her shoulder to see if anyone important was watching. "Hi, Dad," she whispered, her voice tight with anxiety. "You should probably stay put. Trent's parents are everywhere." "I just wanted to give you this," I replied gently, my voice perfectly steady despite the cold reception. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden jewelry box. It was crafted from high-quality mahogany, the same wood salvaged from the first commercial tugboat I'd bought decades ago. For the past 3 weeks, I'd hand-sanded it in my workshop, polishing the surface until the beautiful grain shone like glass. I had delicately carved her initials into the lid, just like I used to carve her name into the wooden blocks she played with before that painful divorce tore our lives apart. I held the box out to her. "I made this for you to keep your new ring safe." Brooke stared down at the box. For a fleeting second, a flash of genuine, uninhibited warmth crossed her face. She remembered, but that warmth was immediately replaced by a surge of intense embarrassment. She scanned the crowded room in a panic. Instead of opening it to appreciate the craftsmanship, she snatched the box from my hand and tried to shove it deep into her small designer clutch. It wouldn't fit. She fumbled with it, her cheeks flushing a deep red with shame. "Thanks, Dad," she mumbled, eyes fixed on the floor. "I'll put it away later. Please, just go sit down. Don't let Trent see us together." It was already too late. Heavy, confident footsteps approached from behind me. A thick, suffocating wave of expensive designer cologne announced Trent Caldwell's arrival before he even spoke. "What do we have here?" Trent asked, his booming voice cutting through the soft background music. He stepped aggressively between Brooke and me, his cold eyes locked on the mahogany box still clutched in her trembling hand. "Nothing," Brooke stammered, shrinking under his intense, controlling gaze. "Just a small gift from my father." Trent didn't ask for permission. He reached out and snatched the box directly from her. He held it up to the light of the chandelier, inspecting it with a mocking, exaggerated scrutiny. A cruel, condescending smile spread across his clean-shaven face. "Did you make this yourself, old man?" Trent asked, carelessly flipping the box in his hand. "It looks like something discarded from a flea market or a dusty garage sale." I kept my expression completely neutral, my hands folded calmly in front of me. "I carved it from solid mahogany. It's a family tradition." Trent let out a loud theatrical laugh, intentionally drawing the attention of several wealthy guests nearby. "A tradition?" he mocked, shaking his head with mock pity. "Well, Brooke and I have better traditions now, the kind that come in little blue Tiffany boxes. There's really no room in our amazing new penthouse for these basic, homemade crafts." Brooke turned her head away, unable to meet my eyes. She didn't defend me. She didn't ask for the box back. She just stood there, silently enduring it, terrified of upsetting the man she viewed as her wealthy savior. Trent turned to a waiter passing by with a tray of drinks. He grabbed a heavy crystal glass filled with dark, expensive whiskey and melting ice. He took a cocky sip, then looked back at me with a sneer of pure malice. Keeping his eyes locked on mine, he placed the small mahogany box on a nearby cocktail table. Then, with deliberate and extreme disrespect, he slammed the wet, sweating whiskey glass directly onto the finely carved lid. "It makes a fantastic coaster, though," Trent said, a vicious, triumphant light flickering in his eyes. "Thanks for your little contribution, Harrison. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have real guests to entertain tonight." The condensation from the glass immediately began to pool on the polished wood, threatening to ruin the countless hours of heart and soul I'd poured into it. Every basic human instinct in my body, every ounce of raw power I'd mastered as a man who regularly commanded boardrooms and crushed ruthless corporate takeovers, was screaming at me to grab him by his tailored lapels and dismantle his fake world right then and there. But I held back. A predator never strikes while the prey is merely testing the water. I needed him to feel completely invincible. I took a slow, calculated breath, ready to simply move the heavy glass and walk away. But before I could, the elegant atmosphere of the room shifted. A man shoved his way through the floral arrangements, heading straight for our table. He was definitely not an invited guest. He wore a cheap, heavily worn leather jacket over a dark, wrinkled t-shirt. His face was weathered, his nose slightly crooked, and his dark eyes held the cold, dead-eyed gaze of a man who made his living collecting dangerous debts. Ignoring the elite socialites around him, he walked straight up behind Trent. Without a word, the man in the leather jacket reached out and grabbed Trent's tailored shoulder with a brutal, crushing grip. Trent spun around, mouth open to lash out, fully prepared to vent his arrogant rage on anyone who dared touch him. But the moment Trent's eyes locked onto the man's face, his arrogant mask shattered into a million tiny pieces. The color drained from his face, leaving him ghostly white. His jaw trembled. The booming voice he'd used to humiliate me just seconds ago evaporated into thin air. He was speechless. The man shoved Trent forward. Trent stumbled slightly, his eyes wide with absolute terror, as the stranger forced him toward a dark, empty hallway behind us. I watched the door close behind them, cutting off the light from that narrow corridor. The live band continued playing a mellow jazz melody, a sound that felt completely detached from the sudden violence I'd just witnessed. The rest of the room seemed to notice nothing. The wealthy guests continued clinking their champagne flutes and laughing, completely unaware that the groom had just been manhandled by a thug in a leather jacket inside a highly secure Hampton estate. I turned my attention back to Brooke. She stood frozen by the floral arrangement, nervously smoothing the wrinkles in her gown. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes fixed on the hardwood floor. She'd seen it, but she was desperate to pretend nothing unusual had happened. I stepped toward her, keeping my voice low and calm so I wouldn't startle her. I asked her who that aggressive man was and why he had grabbed Trent with such force. Brooke forced a bright, unnatural smile before looking at me. When she finally met my gaze, her eyes were filled with a fierce defensiveness, the result of years of status-obsessed conditioning her mother had instilled in her. She let out a short, dismissive laugh and waved a hand in the air. "Oh, that was just a frustrated contractor," she said smoothly, reciting the lie with the precision of someone reading from a script. "Trent manages a $50 million hedge fund, Dad. He's a very important figure in the financial district. People are constantly begging him to invest, and when he firmly turns down their business proposals, they sometimes get a little too desperate." I listened in silence. A manager running a $50 million hedge fund doesn't get shoved into dark hallways by a frustrated contractor. A powerful figure with $50 million would have dedicated security, or at least the confidence to stand his ground in public. Trent had folded like a cheap tissue, his eyes screaming raw fear, but Brooke was desperate to believe it to protect her fragile fantasy. She lifted her chin, adopting that familiar, haughty posture Patricia had mastered. "Trent deals with incredibly high-stakes deals all the time," she continued, her voice dripping with condescension. "It's completely different from the world you're used to, Dad. He's under massive pressure because he's responsible for building a massive empire for our future." Before I could question the obvious inconsistencies in her story, Brooke proudly raised her left hand. She intentionally extended her delicate fingers to catch the bright light of the chandelier above us. Resting heavily on her ring finger was an ostentatious stone. It was at least 3 carats, set in a chunky, heavy white gold band. She stared at the rock with a look of absolute reverence, not as a symbol of enduring love, but as a shiny trophy of her newly elevated social status. "Trent had it custom made just for me," she said, her voice full of smug superiority. "He wanted to make sure I had the absolute best. He told me a woman of my caliber deserves a diamond that commands respect the moment she walks into a room." I looked from that massive ring to my daughter's beautiful face. The harsh, judgmental look she gave me was a perfect replica of her mother's. Then she delivered the calculated final blow. He's providing a glorious life that you could never offer, Dad, she said coldly. A life where I'll never have to worry about smelling like machine oil or settling for second best. You could learn a lot about success from a man like him. I swallowed the bitter pain rising in my throat. Hearing your own child speak to you with such profound contempt is a unique torture. It felt like a weight crushing my chest. I'd spent 40 years deliberately sacrificing my own comfort, working 80 hours a week on the docks, building a global shipping network from scratch so she would never have to experience the soul-crushing grip of poverty. And yet, she stood there, fully convinced that my worn work boots were a shameful symbol of failure rather than the foundation of the incredibly privileged life she enjoyed. I didn't raise my voice in anger. I didn't defend my hidden bank accounts. Instead, I focused my attention entirely on the stone on her left hand. "Can I see it?" I asked calmly, keeping my tone gentle and supportive. Brooke hesitated, clearly surprised by my non-confrontational reaction to her harsh insult. She reluctantly brought her hand a few inches closer to my face, her arm rigid. I leaned in to get a closer look, squinting against the unforgiving light of the chandelier to examine the large rock. In the late 90s, my shipping company won a massive contract to transport raw diamonds from South Africa to the top jewelers in the United States. For 5 full years, I personally oversaw the complex logistics of these multi-million-dollar shipments. I spent countless hours sitting quietly in secure vaults next to master gemologists, learning how to accurately identify the unmistakable traits of a real diamond. I learned about the internal fire, how a true diamond intensely bends and refracts light, radiating a brilliant, deep-colored sparkle from its solid core. I stared hard at the stone on Brooke's finger. It was undeniably large, cut with mathematical symmetry, and to an untrained eye it looked completely flawless. But as the chandelier light hit the polished facets, my trained instincts immediately caught the glaring defect. The refraction of light was all wrong. The light reflecting from this large stone lacked the intense brilliance of a real diamond. It was flat, glass-like, and lifeless. It lacked the necessary internal fire. It was very shiny, yes, but it was completely hollow inside. It was a well-cut cubic zirconia, an absolute fake. My heart sank, heavy with a terrible realization. The truth hit me with the devastating force of a speeding freight train. My beautiful daughter wasn't just marrying an arrogant, incredibly unpleasant man. She was tying her entire life and future to a desperate, dangerous con artist. A man who bragged to crowds about a $50 million hedge fund, but couldn't afford a real diamond for his beautiful bride. A man who allowed himself to be physically threatened and shoved by a street-level debt collector in the middle of a secure Hampton estate. The fake ring, the fear in his eyes, the aggressive bluster meant to cover his panic. It was all a meticulously constructed, fragile house of cards built entirely on desperate lies, and Brooke was standing right in the center of it. I had to act now. I gently let go of Brooke's hand, allowing her to retreat into the safe illusion she'd constructed. She smoothed her silk gown, gave me a defensive nod, and vanished into the sea of tailored tuxedos. I stood alone by the floral arrangement, letting the waves of reality wash over me. My only daughter was walking into a burning building, and she was doing everything she could to protect the arsonist who lit the match. I turned and walked back to the isolated chair by the kitchen doors. The string quartet stopped playing, their melody replaced by the crisp sound of silver spoons tapping against crystal champagne flutes. The low murmur of the elite conversation faded into an expectant silence. At the front of the hall, under the perfect illumination of the largest chandelier, stood Trent Caldwell. He held a glass of vintage champagne in one hand and a wireless microphone in the other. He radiated a toxic, artificial confidence that only a desperate man could project. He waited for the room to fall silent, relishing the absolute attention of the wealthy guests. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Trent began, his voice rumbling through the speakers with a practiced rhythm. "Tomorrow I marry the most beautiful woman in the world. But tonight I want to talk about legacy. I want to talk about what it means to build an empire from scratch, and what it means to be a man who shapes the future rather than just existing in it. He paced back and forth on the stage, intentionally making eye contact with the wealthiest investors at the front tables. Some of you know that for the past 6 months, my hedge fund has been aggressively pursuing a monumental commercial acquisition. Trent continued. It's been a grueling war of attrition against some of the oldest wealth in this city. But I am very proud to announce tonight, in front of my bride-to-be and my closest allies, that we have finally closed the deal. The room erupted in eager applause. Patricia beamed, clapping enthusiastically from the front row. Trent held up his hand to quiet them, a smug smile on his face. We have just acquired the primary commercial rights to the Sterling Tower on Madison Avenue, he declared boldly, chest puffed out. 50 floors of prime, untouched Manhattan real estate. It's an absolute crown jewel, and it now officially belongs to us. Applause rang out again, louder this time. Trent waited, letting the adulation feed his fragile ego. Then his gaze swept the room. His sightline moved past the billionaires, the socialites, and his beaming fiancée. His eyes landed on that dark, isolated corner by the kitchen door. His gaze locked directly onto me. The microphone picked up his soft chuckle. You know, building a legacy requires a specific type of ruthless evolution, Trent said, his tone dropping into a condescending drawl. It requires leaving the old ways behind. I look around this room and I see the absolute future, but I also remember the pathetic past. Some people, he paused dramatically, gesturing with his champagne glass in my direction, some people work until they're 70, just to afford a rusted pickup truck and a cheap suit. The silence in the room grew heavy. They work themselves to the bone for decades, Trent continued, his voice dripping with vicious cruelty, convinced that blind, mindless labor somehow yielded greatness. But true greatness isn't earned by sweating in the dirt like a peasant. I made my first million at 25. I'll be acquiring Manhattan skyscrapers before I'm 35. Cheers to rapid evolution, and cheers to leaving the dinosaurs where they belong, buried deep in the past. He raised his glass high into the air. Some of his groomsmen snickered, turning to stare directly at me in the dark corner. Patricia let out a short, mocking laugh, enthusiastically lifting her crystal flute in agreement. The cruelty in the room was a heavy, suffocating blanket of elitist disdain, directed entirely at a man they deemed a pathetic failure. I looked at Brooke. She was looking down at her lap, pale, her hands clasped tightly together. She didn't stand up. She didn't defend the man who had worked countless cold double shifts on the docks just to pay for her childhood medical bills. She simply accepted my public humiliation, taking it as her ticket into Trent's imagined kingdom. I didn't shift in my uncomfortable seat. I didn't look away, nor did I show a single hint of embarrassment or anger. I calmly reached out, picked up my simple glass of ice water, and took a small sip with extreme, deliberate composure. The cold water slid down my throat, fitting perfectly with the absolute ice that had just settled permanently into my veins. Trent Caldwell was no master of the financial universe. He was an incredibly stupid, reckless child, playing a dangerous game he couldn't possibly understand. I didn't need a corporate background check to know he was lying about his massive commercial acquisition. I didn't need my aggressive legal team to verify the current operations of the Sterling Tower on Madison Avenue. I knew exactly who owned that 50-story building. I bought the Sterling Tower 12 years ago during a massive, destructive market downturn. I completely renovated the entire structure, spent $60 million upgrading the commercial infrastructure, and placed it permanently in a private, heavily protected trust, strictly under the umbrella of Cole Enterprises. I am the sole and absolute owner of the Sterling Tower. No outside investors, no hedge fund consortium involved, and absolutely no one, least of all a lowly con artist like Trent Caldwell, is actively negotiating its commercial rights. Trent had just randomly picked the most impressive, high-profile building he could think of, desperate to impress a room full of wealthy strangers. He had no idea that the tower's true billionaire owner was currently sitting at the absolute worst table in the room, wearing a 15-year-old suit and steel-toed work boots. The lie was so incredibly huge, so easy to verify for anyone who actually held corporate power, that it firmly confirmed my darkest, most unsettling suspicions. The scattered puzzle pieces fell together in my mind. Trent was drowning in dangerous debt. A violent, street-level debt collector had aggressively crashed an exclusive wedding rehearsal. He had pawned a priceless, sentimental heirloom just to buy a fake rhinestone. And now he was publicly fabricating multi-million-dollar real estate deals, desperate to project a fragile illusion of extreme wealth. He wasn't just lying to my daughter. He was lying to his investors, his so-called friends, and the violent criminals he'd foolishly borrowed millions from. The dominoes were beginning to fall, and Trent was dancing wildly at the very bottom of the chain, completely oblivious to his impending absolute destruction. He took another longing sip of his $1,000 champagne, blindly basking in the warm glow of a powerful kingdom he didn't own. I placed my water glass steadily on the table. The fatherly rage I'd felt briefly earlier had vanished, replaced by the terrifying cold focus of a top-tier corporate predator preparing to dismember its prey. Let him drink his expensive champagne. Let him enjoy the applause he didn't earn. Let him believe he'd successfully humiliated this old, ignorant mechanic in front of the coastal elite. Tomorrow, the bill would finally come due, and I would collect everything, down to the last cent. When the applause for his fabricated achievements finally began to subside, Trent held up his hand to quiet the room. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his sleek, expensive smartphone. He looked at the blank screen with exaggerated importance, frowning as if he'd just received an urgent message requiring his immediate attention. He leaned into Brooke, whispered something in her ear, and addressed his captivated audience again. "I am so sorry to interrupt the festivities," Trent announced, his voice projecting an air of profound regret. "But when duty calls, a man must answer. I've arranged a conference call with a rather influential senator regarding some upcoming financial legislation on Wall Street. It's an absolute nuisance, I know, but these elite politicians simply don't understand the concept of a weekend off. Please enjoy the caviar and keep the champagne flowing. I'll be right back." The guest whispered in extreme awe, clearly impressed by his supposed political connections. Patricia nodded approvingly, a greedy glint in her eyes as she watched her future son-in-law. Trent planted a practiced kiss on Brooke's cheek, straightened his expensive tie, and turned to leave the grand dining hall. But I noticed something the room full of admiring socialites completely ignored. As Trent turned his back on the crowd and walked toward the heavy glass doors leading to the garden, his broad shoulders immediately slumped. That confident, arrogant strut evaporated with every step he took away from the bright lights. His breathing became ragged, and the hands swinging at his sides clenched into tight fists. That was how a man walking to the gallows walked, not a man who'd just taken a routine call from a political ally. I waited a full 30 seconds before I pushed my unsteady chair back from the table. No one noticed the old mechanic quietly slipping out through the swinging kitchen doors. The kitchen staff was too busy plating the next course to notice me passing through the narrow service corridor that led directly to the estate's rear garden. The night air was crisp, carrying the sharp, salty scent of the Atlantic. The vast garden was a maze of manicured hedges, marble statues, and bubbling stone fountains, all illuminated by soft landscape lighting. It was a beautiful, serene setting, but tonight it felt like a hunting ground. I stepped carefully onto the cobblestone path, the thick rubber soles of my old work boots absorbing the sound of my steps. I moved slowly, staying in the deep shadows cast by the towering oak trees. I didn't need to look for long. I could hear the frantic crunching of gravel coming from a secluded, dimly lit alcove at the edge of the estate grounds. I quietly crouched behind a row of tall, manicured bushes. From my hiding spot, I had a clear, unobstructed view of the groom. Trent was completely alone, but he wasn't holding the sleek, expensive smartphone he'd been flashing in the dining hall. Instead, he was gripping a cheap, plastic burner phone with aggressive intensity. His hands were shaking violently as he punched in a number. The transformation in his demeanor was shocking. The slick, untouchable billionaire persona was completely gone. In its place was a terrified, desperate child. Sweat glistened on his forehead, reflecting the pale moonlight. He tugged frantically at the collar of his tailored suit, as if it were suddenly strangling him. He paced back and forth on the gravel path, his chest heaving with deep, ragged breaths. He held the cheap plastic phone to his ear, his entire body tense and rigid. When the person on the other end answered, Trent's tone had none of the commanding authority of a hedge fund manager. He spoke in a high-pitched, trembling tone, like a man begging for his life. "Listen to me. You have to listen to me," Trent pleaded, his voice breaking with sheer desperation. "I know what the deadline is, but you can't do this tonight." "Not tonight. I'm literally standing here at my rehearsal dinner right now. The wedding is tomorrow. You just have to give me a little more time. I swear on my life that I have everything completely under control." The person on the other end spoke for a brief moment. Whatever they said made Trent flinch, as if he'd been struck physically. He squeezed his eyes shut and ran a trembling hand through his perfectly styled hair, ruining the expensive look. "I'm not trying to hide from you," Trent hissed, his tone dropping to a frantic, whispered plea. "I'm telling you the absolute truth. I just need 48 more hours. That's all I'm asking for. 48 hours. Once I marry her tomorrow afternoon, the marriage trust unlocks automatically. Her grandfather left her a massive account, and as her husband, I'll have full legal authority to access every cent. You'll get your $4 million back. I'll even add a significant interest payment for the extension. Just please, don't send anyone else to the venue. If you scare her family, you'll ruin everything." Another heavy silence. Trent listened to the final, chilling verdict delivered by his ruthless creditor. He let out a desperate, defeated gasp. "Please don't do that," Trent begged, tears of pure terror welling in his eyes. "I'll have that $4 million by Monday morning. I promise you. Just let me marry the girl." The call ended. Trent stared at the cheap burner phone in sheer terror. A raw, guttural sound of frustration erupted from his throat. He smashed the plastic device against the estate's brick wall, shattering it into pieces. He then kicked a heavy landscape stone with all his might, screaming curses at the empty night sky. He bent over, hands on his knees, breathing deeply and shakily as he tried to reassemble his shattered facade. I stood motionless behind the thick hedge, wrapped in the cold shadows. The piercing alarm in my gut had just been proven entirely correct. Trent wasn't a successful businessman. He was a monumental con artist who owed $4 million to incredibly dangerous people. He was using my daughter, planning to drain her protected trust fund the very second the ink dried on their marriage certificate. He viewed Brooke only as a convenient, wealthy, sacrificial lamb to save his own miserable skin. I turned slowly, left the alcove, and walked back toward the kitchen doors. I didn't need to hear another word. The time for gathering clues was over. It was time to quietly initiate the operation to protect my only child. I was going to burn his fake empire to the ground and ensure he could never, ever threaten my family again. This ruthless corporate predator was now fully awake. I slid silently back along the garden path, leaving Trent to face his crumbling reality. When I re-entered the grand dining hall, the atmosphere had shifted. The formal dinner service had ended, and the guests were migrating toward the marble dance floor. I watched from the shadows as Trent reappeared. He strode back into the room with his arrogant gait, tightened his suit jacket, and flashed an empty smile. He grabbed Brooke by the waist and pulled her onto the floor. They spun under the crystal chandeliers, a picture of absolute perfection. To the untrained eye, he was a confident billionaire celebrating his final night as a bachelor. But I knew the truth. I knew that beneath the silk and the cologne, he was sweating bullets because he owed $4 million to absolute demons. But knowing the truth and proving it to a brainwashed daughter were two different battles. Brooke had spent 2 years immersing herself in Trent's fantasy. She wouldn't believe a word from a father she viewed as a bitter mechanic. If I confronted her with just a story about an overheard phone call, she would run straight to Trent. He would likely convince her to elope tonight, cutting me out of her life permanently to ensure he got access to her trust fund. I needed physical, undeniable proof. I needed the smoking gun that would shatter his illusions and leave Brooke unable to deny the reality standing right in front of her. I turned away from the dance floor and walked decisively toward the grand foyer. I pushed out the front doors, leaving the blaring music behind. The driveway was a gravel-covered circle, packed with the world's most expensive luxury cars. I stood at the top step, scanning the ocean of automotive engineering. I was looking for one specific vehicle. Earlier that day, Trent had spent 20 minutes bragging to older investors about his brand new custom Porsche 911. Every word was a carefully crafted lie designed to blind the wealthy guests around him. He claimed it was an impulse buy, a little reward for closing his Manhattan deal. I spotted the flashy midnight black Porsche, parked at the front of the VIP line. I walked down the stone steps toward the valet stand. A young attendant stepped forward to assist me. I reached into my pocket, pulled out another crisp $100 bill, and slid it across the wooden podium. I told the young man that my future son-in-law had accidentally locked a very important wedding document in his Porsche, and I needed 5 minutes alone with the car to retrieve it. The valet looked at the money, then at my serious, unyielding expression. He tucked the cash into his pocket, handed me the electronic key fob without a word, and turned to help another guest. I walked to the black Porsche and hit the unlock button. The headlights flashed sharply in the dark. I pulled the heavy door open and leaned inside. To anyone else, this was the ultimate symbol of financial success. But my life was built on engines and logistics. I knew how to look past the shiny exterior. I slid into the low driver's seat and popped the glove box. A man who truly owned a high-performance sports car would keep meticulous records. He would have his registration, insurance, and maintenance warranties organized perfectly. The glove box was almost empty, save for a brightly colored manila folder. I pulled it out and turned on the overhead dome light. I flipped the cover and began reading. The logo at the top didn't belong to an exclusive dealership or high-end leasing agency. It belonged to a notorious, shady, exotic car rental service on the outskirts of the city. My eyes scanned the detailed lease agreement. Trent Caldwell hadn't bought this car. He didn't even have a long-term lease. He was renting it by the hour. The contract specified a strict 24-hour lease period, starting yesterday afternoon and ending tomorrow morning before the ceremony. He had paid an exorbitant, predatory interest rate just to have this car sitting in the valet line for a single night, purely to maintain his fragile illusion of wealth. I folded the lease agreement and carefully tucked it into the inner pocket of my suit jacket. But my gut told me there was more to find. A man that desperate always leaves a trail of messy mistakes. I started searching the rest of the cockpit. As I leaned over to check the floor on the passenger side, my hand brushed against a crumpled, heavily creased, bright yellow paper tucked under the seat. I pulled it out and smoothed the sharp creases on my knee. I held it up to the overhead light. It was a formal legal document, stamped with the official seal of the City Housing Court. In bold black letters at the top, it read, "Final Eviction Notice." I read the details printed below. The document was addressed directly to Trent Caldwell. It listed a tiny, dilapidated apartment in an extremely undesirable neighborhood, miles away from the wealthy financial district he claimed to rule. According to the court order, Trent had been delinquent on basic rent for over 6 months. The landlord had already secured a legal judgment against him, and city marshals were scheduled to forcibly remove his belongings and physically lock him out of the property next Tuesday. I leaned back into the leather seat, the sheer scale of his deception washing over me like a cold wave. Trent wasn't just broke, he was completely destitute. The billionaire hedge fund manager, the man who arrogantly mocked my boots, the man claiming to buy skyscrapers in Manhattan, would be completely homeless in a matter of days. The expensive suit was likely a rental. The champagne was being rung up on a fraudulent tab he had no intention of paying, and his entire existence, his plan to pay off violent creditors and avoid living on the street, depended entirely on tricking my daughter into signing those marriage papers tomorrow afternoon. I carefully folded the bright yellow eviction notice and placed it in my breast pocket alongside the lease agreement. I turned off the dome light, stepped out of the rented Porsche, and locked the door behind me. I walked back to the valet stand, returned the fob to the young attendant, and gave him a slight nod of gratitude. The crisp night air suddenly felt exhilarating. The heavy burden of uncertainty had vanished, replaced by the cold, calculated precision of a father preparing for all-out war. Tomorrow, this grand illusion would shatter in front of everyone, and I would be the one holding the hammer. I walked slowly up the estate's wide stone steps. The cold night wind cleared my head. Every step I took felt solid. In the main hall, the party had reached a fever pitch. The loud, pulsating rhythm of modern dance music vibrated through the heavy wooden doors. I bypassed the crowded ballroom. I had no interest in watching these oblivious socialites worship a fake idol. Instead, I moved through a quiet, softly lit corridor toward the men's restroom. The heavy mahogany door was left slightly ajar. As I pushed it open, the bass was immediately muted, replaced by the harsh, echoing sound of rapid, panicked breathing. I walked in quietly and let the door glide shut behind me. The restroom was a lavish display of marble and brass, smelling of citrus hand soap and the pungent odor of Trent Caldwell's overwhelming designer cologne. Trent was standing alone at the very end of the long vanity. He had stripped off his tuxedo jacket and tossed it carelessly onto the pristine floor. His silk tie was yanked loose, hanging crookedly around his neck. He was leaning heavily over the polished marble sink, gripping the brass edges until his knuckles turned white. He had the gold faucet turned to the max, aggressively splashing icy water directly onto his face. He gasped loudly, shoulders heaving as he struggled to pull air into his terrified lungs. He was in the middle of a full-scale panic attack. The carefully constructed armor of the untouchable billionaire hedge fund manager had melted away, leaving behind nothing but a cornered animal. I stood quietly near the entrance, observing him with clinical detachment. He was muttering desperate, broken curses, staring frantically at his dripping reflection in the expansive vanity mirror. For a long time, Trent didn't notice my presence. He continued hyperventilating, splashing cold water on his pale skin, trying to shock his nervous system into submission. When he looked up to grab a hand towel, his frantic eyes swept across the mirror and caught my reflection standing right behind him. The transition was instantaneous and pathetic. The raw fear on his face vanished in a heartbeat, replaced by a sudden surge of artificial, manufactured rage. It was the overcompensation of a weak man who knew he'd just been exposed. He spun around, water dripping heavily from his chin, soaking the collar of his dress shirt. He puffed out his chest, eyes narrowed into a vicious glare. He took 2 quick, aggressive steps toward me, his dress shoes slipping slightly on the smooth marble floor. "What are you doing sneaking in here, you creepy old mechanic?" Trent spat, his voice trembling. "Are you stalking me now?" I kept my hands casually at my sides, my posture relaxed. "I'm just using the restroom, Trent," I replied smoothly, my voice devoid of any emotion. "You look like you're struggling. Do you need me to call a doctor for you?" That simple statement of fact shattered his remaining fragile restraint. The shame of being seen in his pathetic state by a man he viewed as garbage pushed him over the edge. Trent lunged forward with a surge of unearned arrogance. He grabbed my suit lapels with his wet hands and shoved me backward with force. My lower back hit the edge of the marble vanity with a dull thud. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my hands to strike back. I stood there like a solid brick wall, unmoved by the frantic, shaking force of a terrified boy. Trent leaned in close, his face only inches from mine. He smelled of expensive whiskey, stale fear, and nervous sweat. "Listen to me very carefully, you pathetic old man," Trent hissed, saliva flying from his lips as he tried to project authority. "I was generous to even let you sit in that dining room tonight. I tolerated your miserable existence because Brooke begged me to be nice, but this is my world. You don't belong here. You're nothing but a dirty mechanic who failed his family. I expect you to stay out of my way tomorrow. You sit in the back row. You keep your mouth shut. You do not embarrass my beautiful bride with your disgusting poverty. If you ruin the perfect wedding, I will personally destroy what little remains of your miserable life. Do you understand me?" He shoved me hard against the marble sink one last time for emphasis. Then he abruptly released my lapels and stepped back, as if touching my suit physically disgusted him. He stood there panting, waiting for me to shrink away, apologize, or react with the submissive fear he was desperate to see. I did none of those things. I just watched him, my expression completely blank. I slowly reached out and calmly straightened the lapels of my suit jacket, smoothing out the wrinkles his wet hands had left behind. The silence in the restroom grew heavy and uncomfortable. I wasn't afraid at all, and that terrified him more than if I'd thrown a punch. A predator recognizes a weak animal instantly, and deep in his hollow core, Trent knew his aggressive performance had completely failed. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. Without waiting for a response, Trent turned, snatched his tuxedo jacket from the wet floor, and blindly reached into his back pocket for his thick leather wallet, intending to shove some cash out in a frenzied state. His hands were shaking too violently to maintain basic coordination. As he shoved the wallet aggressively toward the pocket of his tailored trousers, he missed the opening completely. The heavy wallet caught on the edge of the fabric and flipped awkwardly in his fumbling grasp. He cursed under his breath, grabbed the wallet, shoved it deep into his pocket on the second try, spun around, and bolted out of the restroom, slamming the heavy mahogany door shut behind him. The thunderous sound of the door faded, leaving the lavish restroom in total silence once again. I stood by the marble vanity, breathing in the quiet calm. I looked down at the exact spot where Trent had been frantically fumbling for his expensive leather wallet. Lying quietly on the intricate geometric pattern of the tile floor was a very small, rectangular, bright pink slip of paper. It had drifted out of his overstuffed wallet completely unnoticed as he made his panicked exit. I stepped forward, bent down slowly, and picked up the small slip with my calloused fingers. The texture of the heavy cardstock felt very familiar. It wasn't a restaurant receipt or a business card. It was an official pawnshop transaction slip. I flipped it over and read the faded black ink clearly stamped on the front. The slip clearly detailed the recent sale of a vintage, highly recognizable diamond necklace, pawned for a fraction of its true value to desperately scrape together the funds to purchase a cubic zirconia ring. This was the final piece of physical evidence. I held the small pink slip up to the harsh fluorescent light of the marble vanity. My callous thumb traced the faded ink, my brain racing to process the devastating information printed on the heavy cardstock. It was an official transaction record from a pawnshop deep in the Diamond District, known for its discretion. The date stamped in the top right corner was exactly 3 months ago. That was the very same week Trent had officially proposed to my daughter. I squinted at the detailed item description, and a cold knot formed in my stomach. The receipt didn't just list a generic piece of jewelry. It explicitly described the exact cut, clarity, and weight of a flawless 3-carat diamond. As the devastating truth pieced itself together, my breathing slowed. Trent hadn't purchased a custom ring to bathe my daughter in luxury. He had taken the antique heirloom ring that Brooke's late grandmother had entrusted to him for the proposal. He had ruthlessly pried the priceless, flawless, multi-generational diamond out of the antique platinum setting. He sold her precious family legacy for quick cash, merely to save his own truly miserable life. To cover his tracks, he'd set a cheap, dull cubic zirconia into her grandmother's original band. He presented it to Brooke as a massive custom upgrade, fully exploiting her manufactured longing for high society approval. She was wearing that fake rock with pride, having no idea that the real diamond, the one that represented her family history, had been pawned to a stranger. I read the final payout amount, printed in bold at the bottom of the pink slip. It was a massive amount of liquid cash, enough to pay off extremely large, extremely urgent personal expenses without a moment's hesitation. My brain instantly connected the specific date on the pawn receipt to another critical timeline. 3 months ago was the same week Patricia was proudly bragging that Trent had booked this grand, ultra-exclusive coastal estate for the wedding weekend. She bragged to anyone who would listen about how incredibly generous Trent was to have paid the astronomical venue deposit entirely in cash up front. The mystery was now completely unraveled. He hadn't used hedge fund profits to pay for this lavish rehearsal dinner. He had used the cash stolen from Brooke's own family legacy to temporarily fund his pathetic, grand illusion. Brooke was standing on the edge of absolute disaster, preparing with enthusiasm to marry an incredibly dangerous, extremely desperate con artist. The man she thought was a billionaire was actually a penniless fraud who was actively dodging violent street-level criminals. He was using her to survive, planning to drain her grandfather's massive trust fund the very moment those marriage papers became legally binding tomorrow. I folded the pink slip precisely in half and tucked it safely into my breast pocket alongside the rented Porsche, documents, and the legal eviction notice. I now had a complete, irrefutable blueprint of his dark deception. An overwhelming urge to storm out to the dance floor, grab him by the lapels of his rented suit, and drag him out surged through my veins. Every protective fatherly instinct was screaming at me to grab my daughter, show that pink receipt to the entire crowd, and destroy his fake kingdom instantly. But I forced my racing heart to slow down. I closed my eyes and took a long, steadying breath in the quiet restroom. Acting on pure emotional impulse is how amateur men lose wars. A true top-tier predator understands the critical importance of perfect timing, undeniable leverage, and absolute overwhelming force. If I just walked out and told Brooke the truth right now, she would never believe me. For years, she had been thoroughly brainwashed by Patricia's toxic materialism. To Brooke, I was nothing more than a poor, bitter dad living in a dusty trailer park, desperately trying to sabotage her glorious path to high society. She would look at that pawn receipt, and Trent would effortlessly conjure up another smooth, plausible lie. He would claim it was a complex investment strategy or a temporary business loan, and she would swallow every word eagerly to protect her fantasy. A simple piece of paper wasn't enough to break the deep spell he had cast over her. I needed to back him into a corner in a public space, where no amount of silver-tongued lies could save him. I needed him to build his pedestal as high as possible, so that the inevitable fall would shatter his masquerade forever. As my strategy solidified, the tension in my jaw finally released. I could not fight this battle as a forgotten mechanic. I needed to strike him with the full, terrifying weight of my actual financial empire. I walked out of the quiet restroom and straight through the crowd of laughing, wealthy guests without saying a word. I didn't stop to look at Brooke, who was still in the arms of that absolute monster, spinning blissfully on the polished marble dance floor. I ignored Patricia, who was aggressively waving an empty champagne flute at a passing server. I simply pushed through the heavy front doors and stepped into the cool, dark night. I walked to the valet and requested my rusted pickup truck, waiting patiently in the damp, crisp coastal breeze. When the young attendant brought my truck around, he gave me a sympathetic, slightly pitying look, completely unaware that he was handing the keys to a man who could buy the entire estate with a single phone call. I climbed into the worn driver's seat, turned the ignition, and listened to the familiar, comforting rumble of the reliable engine. I pulled slowly out of the gravel driveway, leaving the bright, hollow mansion far behind. The drive back to the humble roadside motel where I'd rented a room was filled with quiet, profound purpose and absolute focus. Once safely inside my room, I pulled my encrypted satellite phone from my duffel bag, the direct line I used only to coordinate high-level global logistics and massive corporate acquisitions. I dialed the private number of my chief legal counsel, Marcus, a brilliant, utterly ruthless attorney. He answered on the second ring, completely accustomed to my late-night directives. I instructed him to immediately purchase Trent Caldwell's entire commercial debt portfolio. Every loan in his name, every outstanding IOU, and every legal obligation Trent had ever signed was to be transferred to me. Marcus didn't ask unnecessary questions. He simply assured me that my sudden demand would be executed perfectly before the sun rose over the eastern coast. I ended the call and placed the phone carefully on the nightstand. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the pawn slip, the lease agreement, and the eviction notice. I laid the 3 papers side by side on the cheap mattress. Tomorrow, Brooke would walk down the aisle expecting a fairy tale. Instead, I was going to deliver a devastating, unstoppable, and absolutely undeniable hurricane of truth. Trent Caldwell was about to lose everything. The walls of the cheap motel were paper thin, vibrating as heavy semi-trucks passed on the nearby highway. I stared at the three papers, the pawn receipt, the lease agreement, and the eviction notice. Marcus was already working the legal financial markets, acquiring whatever visible commercial debt Trent had foolishly accumulated. But the desperate, panicked conversation I'd overheard in the garden required an entirely different approach. Commercial banks don't send thugs in cheap leather jackets to physically threaten their clients at a formal wedding rehearsal. That kind of aggressive intimidation belongs strictly to the violent shadow economy. For this next phase, I needed absolute security. I grabbed my keys, walked out of the dim room, and back to my rusted F-150, parked under a flickering amber street lamp. The coastal air was thick with salt and damp fog. I climbed into the familiar driver's seat, locked the heavy metal door, and sealed myself inside the quiet, soundproof cabin. I reached under the worn floor mat and popped a hidden, reinforced steel compartment. I pulled out my master encrypted satellite phone, a precision device that was completely untraceable, off the public grid, and reserved exclusively for the most critical, high-stakes operations of my global empire. I dialed a specific, highly encrypted international number. The secure line clicked and connected almost immediately. This time, I wasn't calling Marcus. I was calling Vincent, the chief legal counsel and lead security expert for the darkest, most aggressive branch of Cole Enterprises. He didn't handle corporate mergers or public relations. He handled the brutal reality of international leverage. "Boss," Vincent answered, his voice a low, steady rasp that commanded instant awe. "Vincent," I said, my tone flat, dangerous, and ice cold. "I need a level 1 background check on a man named Trent Caldwell, but don't look at his public financial records. Dig straight into the underground lenders operating in the tri-state area." "No problem," Vincent replied smoothly. "What exactly are we looking for tonight?" "Someone in the shadow market is holding a highly volatile $4 million IOU in his name," I directed. "It's due Monday morning, and they've already sent a physical debt collector to intimidate him in public. I want that debt, Vincent. I want you to find the exact criminal syndicate holding this paper, and I want you to buy it entirely through our untraceable shell companies. Whatever that cartel or loan shark wants for that IOU, double it using untraceable offshore funds. By sunrise tomorrow, I want to be the sole absolute owner of Trent Caldwell's life, liberty, and his entire future. I'll reach the right people immediately," Vincent said without hesitation. "Before the traditional banks open, I will transfer full legal ownership to your primary blind trust." I ended the call and set the heavy satellite phone on the empty passenger seat. I rested my head against the worn fabric headrest and stared out at the foggy windshield. The flickering streetlights cast long, twisted shadows across the empty parking lot. My brain, like a calculating machine, processed the scale of the trap I'd just set. For decades, Patricia had been actively poisoning my daughter's mind, making her believe that true power was defined entirely by loud, ostentatious displays of wealth. She taught Brooke to blindly worship the shiny, hollow shells of men like Trent, while deeply despising the quiet, relentless labor that actually built the modern world. Trent was the tragic product of that shallow, greedy philosophy. His entire adult life had been spent desperately accumulating very expensive props. Fake diamonds, rented sports cars, fabricated hedge funds, all carefully engineered to project an absolute illusion of unquestionable dominance. But he had absolutely no structural foundation. He was a hollow, pathetic statue, built entirely on fragile, quickly shifting sand. True power doesn't need to brag loudly at high-end dinners. True power doesn't need to publicly humiliate a working-class mechanic just to feel important. True power is sitting quietly in a rusted pickup truck in a desolate motel parking lot at 3 a.m., making one untraceable call to buy a desperate man's life, his freedom, and his entire future. I closed my eyes and let rhythmic breathing steady my racing thoughts. The fatherly rage was still there, burning deep in my chest like a massive furnace, but it was fully under control. I wasn't acting out of petty revenge. I was executing a necessary surgical strike to officially save my only daughter from a lifetime of absolute destruction. She would undoubtedly hate me for so aggressively destroying her perfect fairy tale wedding. She would scream, she would cry, and she might even try to banish me from her life forever. But a good father protects his child not to win her immediate, temporary approval. He protects her actively because it is his fundamental sacred duty, no matter the massive personal cost he has to pay. In the cold, silent truck cabin, the long hours passed with agonizing slowness. I watched the heavy coastal fog slowly begin to dissipate as the first faint, gray light of a new dawn began to seep into the eastern sky. My encrypted satellite phone suddenly vibrated on the passenger seat, instantly shattering the heavy, solemn silence of the early morning. I picked it up and answered immediately. "It is officially done, sir," Vincent reported, his voice crisp and purely professional. The underground syndicate holding the $4 million IOU was very eager to liquidate such a problematic debt. They knew Caldwell was a massive, unpredictable flight risk. We have discreetly transferred a full $8 million through secondary offshore shell companies. The official physical IOU and all the highly damaging physical extortion materials they held against him are now legally and permanently your exclusive, absolute property. "Did they ask any questions about this mystery buyer?" I asked, watching the bright sunrise slowly illuminate the rusted hood of my old truck. "Not at all," Vincent replied calmly. "They were just very excited to magically double their dangerous criminal investment in a single night. Trent Caldwell now personally owes you a full $4 million, payable immediately upon your direct demand. You have absolute total financial leverage." "Thank you, Vincent," I said softly. "Stand by for further instructions this afternoon." I ended the call and placed the phone safely back in the hidden floor compartment. The absolute power I desperately needed was finally secured. I stepped out of the heavy truck and walked back to my cramped motel room. I needed to make meticulous preparations for the grand wedding. I carefully laid out my old, outdated Sears suit. I polished my heavy steel-toed boots. I gathered the pawn slip, the lease agreement, the eviction notice, and the digital confirmation of his massive criminal debt. I folded them perfectly and stowed them away. Morning light pierced through the coastal mist, casting a pale glow through the curtains of my cheap motel room. I stood before a cracked mirror and buttoned my outdated Sears suit. The fabric felt stiff, a sharp contrast to the tailored Italian wool I usually wore. I put on the polished steel-toed boots. I picked up the stack of folded, devastating evidence and tucked them safely into my inner breast pocket. They sat against my chest like a loaded weapon. I drove my rusted pickup toward the coastal estate. When I arrived, the grounds were already filled with chaotic energy. Florists were frantically arranging towering white rose stands. Caterers were shouting orders as they set up the outdoor dining tents. I parked my truck near the service entrance, keeping myself completely out of the way. I needed to remain invisible until the right moment. I'd been standing by the door for less than 10 minutes when Patricia spotted me. She was striding across the lawn, clutching an expensive clipboard and barking orders into a silver headset. Her face was tight with the pressure of achieving ultimate perfection. When her gaze locked onto mine, her frantic energy instantly shifted into targeted malice. She ended her call and walked straight toward me. "Harrison, you're an absolute waste, standing here like a lost vagabond," she snapped, her voice dripping with toxic condescension. "The main delivery truck just arrived at the back door with the bulk ice for the outdoor bars. The catering company wants to charge us an extra $200 to unload it. We've already spent a fortune on this venue. We absolutely cannot waste extra money on basic labor. Get to the unloading dock right now and unload those 50 bags of ice. Try to make yourself at least somewhat useful for once in your miserable life." I looked at her angry face. A man who controlled global shipping routes doesn't unload delivery trucks to save $200, but a man building a trap from which there is no escape plays his assigned role perfectly. I didn't argue. I didn't defend my dignity. I lowered my head, gave a submissive nod, and walked toward the gravel unloading dock at the back of the estate. I needed Patricia and Trent to feel absolutely safe, fully convinced that their cruel dominance over me was absolute. The refrigerated delivery truck rumbled loudly near the back door. The rear was wide open, revealing pallets of commercial ice, stacked high. Each bag weighed 40 pounds. I rolled up the sleeves of my cheap suit jacket, revealing my weather-beaten forearms. I reached into the freezing truck, grabbed the first bag, and hoisted it onto my right shoulder. The chill cut through the thin fabric of the suit, sending a shiver through my bones. I turned and began the grueling walk across the vast estate toward the main reception tent. My 70-year-old muscles strained under the weight. I focused on my breathing, falling into the steady rhythm of physical labor I'd learned decades ago on the icy shipping docks of New York Harbor. As I carried the fourth bag of ice across the courtyard, a loud, arrogant laugh erupted from the stone terrace above me. Trent Caldwell emerged from the main house, flanked tightly by 5 groomsmen. They wore matching tailored suits, holding crystal glasses filled with expensive morning mimosas. They looked down at me from the high balcony like ancient kings observing a lowly peasant. Trent pointed a manicured finger directly at me, a cruel, mocking smile spreading across his freshly shaved face. "Look at this pathetic performance, boys," Trent shouted, ensuring his voice was loud enough for me to hear. He leaned over the ornate stone railing, shaking his head dramatically in mock pity. "I told you we had our own private packhorse this weekend." The groomsmen erupted in vicious laughter. One tall man with slicked-back hair raised his glass in a mocking toast. "Keep walking, old man," he shouted at me. "That expensive champagne isn't going to chill itself. You better hurry up. Try not to break a hip." I didn't break my stride. I didn't look up at the balcony. I kept my head down, playing the role of a broken, defeated father to absolute perfection. I let ice water drip down my neck, soaking my collar. I moved the 5th bag, then the 10th, then the 20th. My shoulders ached, and my calloused hands grew numb from the biting cold. The physical pain was intense, but it was nothing compared to the sharp, white-hot focus burning deep in my mind. Every time those arrogant boys laughed, every time Trent shouted another insult from his comfortable height, I felt a distinct, silent vibration coming from deep in my trouser pocket. My encrypted satellite phone was vibrating against my leg. Vincent was sending automated, real-time tactical updates from the Cole Enterprises war room. Every silent buzz was a massive, fatal blow to Trent's fake empire. Buzz. Our shell company had officially filed the paperwork to permanently transfer his $4 million criminal debt. Buzz. The underground syndicate had officially liquidated the offshore payment, completely washing their hands of Trent Caldwell. Buzz. Our aggressive legal team had successfully utilized the new leverage to freeze his 3 primary bank accounts. Buzz. We had successfully reported his fraudulent hedge fund operations to the Federal Financial Regulatory Commission. The trap wasn't just closing, it was slamming shut with bone-crushing, inescapable force. I hoisted the 30th bag of ice onto my aching shoulder. I walked through the rose garden, listening to the groomsmen continue their relentless mockery. They had no idea they were insulting the top-tier predator who now owned Trent's every breath. I moved the 40th bag. Patricia walked past me, flashing a smug sneer when she saw the dark sweat stains forming on my old suit. I moved the 50th, the final bag of ice. As I lifted this massive weight, my phone vibrated one last time. It was a long, sustained vibration, the final confirmation. Vincent had secured the final kill switch. I moved the final bag to the outdoor bar and tossed it heavily into the stainless steel cooler. I straightened up and stretched my stiff back. The labor was done. The humiliating performance was officially over. I pulled down my damp sleeves and buttoned the cheap jacket. The sun was now fully up, shining brilliantly over the massive estate. There were less than 3 hours until the wedding ceremony officially began. I looked up toward the stone balcony. Trent was still standing there, laughing arrogantly, completely unaware that he was already a dead man walking. I turned and walked toward the guest area, absolutely prepared to watch the whole world burn. The vast coastal estate had transformed into an astonishing spectacle of high society opulence. Massive floral arches made of pure white roses and imported orchids lined the central aisle. The string quartet had already tuned their instruments in the shade of the massive oak trees, filling the morning air with soft, elegant classical music. Wealthy guests began arriving in droves, wearing designer gowns and expensive bespoke suits. They mingled casually on the manicured lawn, sipping sparkling water from delicate glasses and admiring the breathtaking ocean view. I stood near the back row of the seating arrangement, wearing my cheap, damp suit, perfectly blending into the background. Patricia darted through the crowd like a frantic general commanding an army. She greeted the elite guests with her practiced fake smile, ensuring everyone noticed the scale of her so-called meticulous planning. I saw my beautiful daughter, Brooke, briefly appear on the upper balcony of the main house. She was surrounded by a whirlwind of frantic bridesmaids and makeup artists. Even from a distance, I could see the genuine happiness radiating from her face. She looked down at the gathering crowd, completely enchanted by the beautiful fairy tale unfolding around her. My heart shattered to see her so thoroughly deceived. She truly believed she was marrying a highly successful, generous man who would protect and cherish her for the rest of her life. She had no idea she was willingly walking into a devastating trap designed by a ruthless predator. I checked the heavy silver watch strapped to my wrist. It was exactly 30 minutes before the wedding ceremony was officially scheduled to begin. The atmosphere was thick with intense, joyful anticipation, but my focus was locked entirely on the strict, tactical timeline Vincent had established. I quietly slipped away from the growing crowd of guests, ducked past the usher station, and walked along a narrow cobblestone path that hugged the perimeter of the grand estate. The path led straight to the back of the property, bypassing the bustling catering tents, and ended in a secluded, shaded alley behind the main service kitchen. As I stepped into the deep shadows of the brick alley, the loud clatter of industrial pots and pans and the frantic shouting of catering staff grew slightly muffled. It was a dark, quiet staging area, hidden away from the glittering wedding venue. I stood perfectly still, waiting in the damp coastal air. Exactly 1 minute later, a sleek black sedan pulled silently to the edge of the service door. A man stepped out of the car. He didn't look like a standard delivery driver. He wore a crisp dark suit, sunglasses, and an earpiece. He moved with agility, carrying the demeanor of a highly efficient, precisely calculated professional corporate security agent. He saw me standing in the shadows and walked straight toward me without hesitation. He stopped exactly 3 feet away and reached into his tailored jacket. He didn't say a word to me. He simply extended his hand and handed over a heavy black leather folder. Embossed on the smooth leather was a tiny, understated silver crest, the logo of Cole Enterprises. I reached out and took the folder from his firm grip. The agent gave me a single, respectful nod, turned on his heel, and briskly walked back to the waiting black sedan. The car reversed smoothly out of the service entrance and vanished onto the coastal highway, leaving me alone in the quiet alley. I rested my back against the cold brick wall of the service kitchen and took a slow, deep breath. I broke the wax seal holding the leather flap shut and opened the folder. The thick stack of documents inside represented the culmination of a radical overnight investigation. I'd expected to see standard predatory loan agreements, exorbitant interest rates, and explicit physical threats of violence linked to underground criminal networks. But as I flipped past the initial financial summaries and began reading the core contractual obligations, my blood instantly turned to ice. The devastating reality of the con was infinitely worse than I could have ever imagined. Trent Caldwell hadn't just borrowed $4 million to maintain his pathetic illusion of wealth. He hadn't just signed his name in front of a violent cartel to assume a dangerous IOU. He had actively, maliciously committed high-level identity theft. I stared at the bold black ink printed on the central mortgage agreement. There, in stark, undeniable print, was her full legal name. Directly below the name was her accurate, highly sensitive Social Security number, along with the highly sensitive routing details for her multi-generational marriage trust fund. Trent had meticulously forged her signature on the primary collateral documents for the criminal syndicate. He had intentionally leveraged my innocent daughter as the sole financial guarantor for his massive illegal debt. If Trent defaulted on the $4 million payment, that violent criminal syndicate wouldn't break his legs. Those forged documents legally authorized them to drain the trust fund entirely. He had essentially offered her up as a sacrifice just to save his own skin. The sheer antisocial cruelty contained in his calculated plan was staggering. He had spent the last 2 years drowning her in fake affection, buying fake diamonds, renting expensive cars, entirely just to gain enough access to her private financial records to execute this massive, devastating theft. A cold, absolute rage settled deep into my bones. The time for observation was officially over. I pulled my encrypted satellite phone from my pocket and dialed the private number. He answered instantly. "Vincent," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet, hollow tone. "I have the black folder. I see the mortgage agreement. He forged her signature. He leveraged her identity to guarantee the entire debt." "I see it as well," Vincent replied smoothly. "The extent of his blatant fraud is truly extraordinary. We have the complete digital trail proving he accessed her private financial files 3 days before securing the illegal loan. The trap is perfectly closed." "Complete the purchase immediately," I commanded, eyes scanning the bustling courtyard outside the alley. "Transfer the maximum amount of offshore funds right now. I don't care what it costs. Buy the debt. Execute the transfer. I want absolute, unquestionable ownership of the entire situation." "Funds are mid-transfer, sir," Vincent confirmed. "The cartel has officially relinquished all claims. You are now the sole exclusive owner of all of Trent Caldwell's debt, his fraudulent contracts, and his entire future. He is officially your property." I ended the call and placed the phone in my pocket. The heavy folder felt like a loaded weapon in my hand. The elaborate game of deception Trent had played was finally coming to a violent end. I walked out of the dark alley and back into the bright sunshine. It was time to attend Brooke's beautiful wedding. The grand seaside wedding ceremony was a flawless, meticulously rehearsed theatrical performance. I sat silently in the back row of pure white folding chairs, watching my beautiful daughter pledge to entrust her entire life to a man who was actively planning to destroy her completely. Brooke looked stunning in her custom gown, genuine joy radiating from her face as she recited her heartfelt vows. Trent played the role of a devoted, deeply emotional billionaire groom to perfection. He held her hands gently, wiped a manufactured tear from his cheek, and promised to protect and provide for her forever. The wealthy guests in the front rows let out sighs and whispers of extreme admiration, completely enchanted by the beautiful, romantic spectacle. I didn't shed a single tear. I just sat quietly in the back, feeling the black leather folder safely against my chest. After the ceremony concluded, the guests transitioned seamlessly into the climate-controlled outdoor reception tent. The level of luxury was staggering. Towering crystal chandeliers hung from fabric ceilings, casting a warm gold light over the perfectly set tables. Servers in white tuxedos circulated constantly, carrying silver trays filled with top-tier champagne and exotic food. I found my assigned seat, a small, dimly lit table tucked into the furthest back corner of the massive tent, right next to the swinging doors of the service kitchen. Patricia had explicitly placed me there to ensure I was completely invisible to her wealthy friends. To me, it was the perfect vantage point to quietly observe the coming catastrophe. As the opulent evening wore on, under the intoxicating pressure of his own perceived success, Trent began to unravel. He downed one expensive vintage champagne after another, fully convinced his fraudulent financial schemes were now perfectly secure. He wandered the dance floor with his groomsmen, slapping their backs and shouting boastful, self-congratulatory jokes. He was certain he had won the ultimate prize, the $4 million he desperately needed to pay off his dangerous creditors. Combined with a beautiful wife and legal access to her massive multi-generational fortune, he felt untouchable. Dinner service finally ended, and the sound of silver spoons clinking against crystal champagne flutes signaled the start of the toasts. Trent snatched the wireless microphone from the band leader and strode with overconfident energy to the dead center of the polished marble dance floor. He began his groom's speech with a series of slick pleasantries, charming the crowd with rehearsed anecdotes and performative humility. He lavished praise on Patricia's taste and support, completely disregarding the fact that his current existence was funded by stolen money. He turned to Brooke, delivering a sickeningly sweet monologue about how she had stolen his heart. The crowd erupted in warm applause, but Trent wasn't satisfied with simple appreciation. Drunk on expensive spirits and consumed by his toxic ego, he needed to assert absolute, unquestionable dominance. As the applause died down, his calculating eyes swept the faces in the crowded reception tent. I knew exactly who he was looking for. His gaze swept past the front tables, cut through the shadows, and locked onto me in the back corner. That charming, handsome smile vanished instantly, replaced by a cruel, malicious sneer. The heavy microphone crackled slightly in his hand. He decided his perfect night wouldn't be complete unless he publicly humiliated the man he viewed as absolute garbage. Trent turned and signaled the catering staff to bring out the wedding cake. A 6-tier masterpiece covered in gold leaf and delicate sugar flowers was carefully wheeled onto the dance floor. Guests murmured in appreciation. Trent snatched the large, ornate silver cake knife from the table. Instead of inviting Brooke to join him for the traditional cutting ceremony, he aggressively carved out a massive chunk of dense vanilla cake and shoved it onto a small china plate with excessive force. He handed the knife back to a startled server. With the plate in his right hand and the microphone gripped tightly in his left, Trent left the cake table and began a targeted march across the crowded ballroom, heading straight for my dark corner. The entire tent grew eerily quiet. Wealthy guests watched the groom march toward the back, exchanging confused, nervous glances. The heavy soles of his expensive leather shoes echoed against the hardwood. Brooke stood rigid in the center of the room, watching her new husband storm toward the back, her smile beginning to falter. Patricia watched the scene with a smirk, clearly anticipating a cruel public performance. Trent finally reached my small table. He stopped just inches away, chest heaving, eyes burning with intense, toxic hatred. I didn't stand up. I didn't look away. I sat there in my cheap suit, hands calm on my lap, radiating an aura of absolute stillness. Trent lifted the microphone to his lips, his voice echoing loudly through the massive sound system to ensure every guest could hear. "You know, I feel incredibly lucky tonight," Trent announced, his tone dripping with thick, vicious sarcasm. "I'm surrounded by so many successful, powerful, and truly important people. But we can't forget the unfortunate. We absolutely must show grace to those who have failed completely in life." Before I could react to his next move, Trent dropped the microphone onto the table. He grabbed the large slice of frosted cake with his bare hand and lunged forward, smashing it directly into my face. The heavy, sticky vanilla cake and thick buttercream frosting slammed into my nose and cheeks, instantly blinding me and coating the front of my cheap, outdated suit jacket. "Have a taste of dessert, you beggar!" Trent shouted aggressively, his voice raspy with vicious, uncontrolled superiority. "Don't let anyone say I left my pathetic father-in-law hungry at my own wedding." The brutal, humiliating act sent a massive shockwave of pure energy through the tent. For one terrifying, horrific second, the massive room went deathly silent. Then Trent's group of rowdy groomsmen erupted into loud, cruel, echoing laughter. Their vicious amusement spread quickly. Patricia stood at the front, her smirk transforming into absolute satisfaction. My daughter was completely silent, looking absolutely terrified, hands clamped over her mouth in pure shock. I remained perfectly still, slowly wiping the heavy frosting from my eyes. The cold cream dripped onto the collar of my old shirt, ruining the cheap fabric. I didn't flinch, nor did I wipe it away. I stared straight into his arrogant eyes, completely silent, absolutely ready to finally unleash my power. The heavy cake slid down my cheek, hitting the pure white tablecloth with a soft thud. The sticky sugar clung to my eyelashes, weighing down the collar of my cheap suit. I didn't raise a hand to wipe it off. I simply sat there, projecting a terrifying stillness that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the massive tent. Trent stood before me, chest puffed out like a conquering hero, basking in the laughter of his groomsmen as they mocked me. He opened his arms to his wealthy audience, bathing in the cruel adulation. Patricia leaned against a nearby table, eyes glinting with malicious joy as she watched this poor mechanic finally put in his place. My daughter remained frozen on the dance floor. Brooke looked as if the ground beneath her had suddenly collapsed. She was stunned, paralyzed by the sudden cruelty displayed by the man she was to marry in less than 24 hours. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Trent turned his back on me, raising his hands to demand another round of applause for his pathetic ego trip. Just then, the massive roar of a chair being dragged violently across the marble floor rang through the quiet room. The sharp sound cut through the fading laughter like a gunshot. From a highly exclusive VIP table near the front of the stage, a tall figure suddenly rose. It was Richard Belmont. Richard was a genuine, cold-blooded billionaire real estate tycoon. He was one of the most powerful and influential developers on the entire East Coast. Trent had obviously invited him to the wedding as a shiny prop, a desperate attempt to legitimize his own fake status by associating with a real industry titan. Richard did not find this farce amusing. His face was flushed red with absolute pure rage. He threw his linen napkin onto his plate and began marching straight across the polished dance floor. Richard Belmont's pure physical presence demanded absolute attention. He was a tall, imposing man who tolerated zero foolishness. The remaining murmurs in the crowd died down instantly. The wedding band sensed the sudden, extremely dangerous shift in atmosphere and cut off abruptly, stopping their soft background music. The silence that descended upon the reception tent became heavy and suffocating. Trent turned around, wearing a confident, slightly confused smile, watching the billionaire approach. He clearly thought Richard was coming over to congratulate him, to join in the cruel joke at the expense of the bride's poor, uneducated father. Trent even took a step forward, extending a hand in the desperate posture of friendship between wealthy men. "Are you absolutely insane?" Richard roared, completely ignoring Trent's outstretched hand and slapping it away as if batting at a diseased insect. The volume of his voice vibrated the crystal chandeliers hanging above us. His eyes were wide with deep shock and profound fury. He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at Trent's chest. "Are you really tired of living, you stupid, arrogant child?" Trent recoiled sharply, his confident smile shattering into a million pieces. The sudden, aggressive verbal assault from a man he deeply admired physically staggered him. "Richard, I don't understand," Trent stammered, his voice dropping 2 octaves into a pathetic, trembling tone. "It's just a harmless joke. He's just a mechanic." "A mechanic?" Richard bellowed, his voice laced with venomous disbelief. He took another step forward, forcing Trent back toward my small table. "You are truly the most pathetic, oblivious con artist I have ever seen in my life. The man sitting at this table is Harrison Cole. He owns the commercial shipping ports that you claim your imports pass through. He owns the global logistics empire that controls half the freight on this coastline. And that massive commercial high-rise in Manhattan that you've been bragging about acquiring throughout the entire cocktail hour, he is the man who bought it in full yesterday morning." A collective gasp rippled through the reception tent, deafeningly loud. 200 wealthy socialites, investors, and family members gasped in pure, undiluted shock. The statement hung in the cold air, completely destroying every lie Trent Caldwell had ever told. The truth hit the room like a tactical missile. Patricia dropped her crystal champagne flute. The expensive glass shattered on the marble floor, but she didn't even blink. Her jaw went completely slack, and her face turned an extremely pale, sickly gray as her greedy eyes darted frantically back and forth between Richard and me. I placed my hands calmly on the table. I reached out slowly to pick up a folded white linen napkin. With a measured, extremely steady motion, I began to wipe the sticky vanilla frosting from my face. I wiped my eyes, cheeks, and chin, letting the naked reality of Richard Belmont's words slowly suffocate the groom. Trent looked as if his soul had just been violently ripped from his body. The color drained from his face entirely, leaving him looking like a terrified corpse. His arrogant shoulders slumped forward. His breathing turned into shallow, ragged gasps. The man who had just smeared cake across my face was now undergoing a complete psychological breakdown in front of 200 people. He turned his head slowly to look at me. The smug, untouchable hedge fund manager was dead. In his place was a terrified little boy, suddenly realizing he had just provoked a legendary apex predator. He stared at the cheap, outdated Sears suit I was wearing and finally understood the terrifying depth of my deception. I hadn't come to this wedding as a poor, defeated mechanic. I had played the prey to lure him into a cage from which there was no escape, and he had walked straight in, eager to lock the heavy steel door behind himself. Brooke took 2 shaky steps forward, her eyes filled with utter confusion and slowly dawning horror. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice trembling in the quiet room. "Is that all true? Are you Harrison Cole?" I placed the soiled linen napkin on the table with extreme care. I didn't look at my daughter for a moment. My eyes were locked entirely on the trembling, sweating con artist standing before me. I pushed my chair back, the wooden legs making a harsh, scraping sound against the hardwood floor. I stood up, regaining my full height. Gone was the slouched, defeated posture. My physical presence shifted dramatically. I straightened my ruined collar and looked down at Trent. "Richard is completely correct," I said very softly. The undeniable, absolute power in my steady voice caused the heavy silence in the room to deepen significantly. Trent stumbled backward, his weak knees barely able to support the crushing weight of his tremendous failure. He opened his mouth, trying to conjure another pathetic lie, but his throat was completely dry. He looked down at the scattered documents, realizing every lie he had meticulously crafted over the last 5 years was now permanently recorded on the floor. I shifted my focus away from the trembling coward and looked directly at my daughter. Brooke stood rigid at the edge of the dance floor, tears swirling in her beautiful eyes. Her hands were still clamped tightly over her mouth. "Brooke," I said softly, softening my voice to speak only to her, "I need you to take off that engagement ring now, sweetheart." She dropped her trembling hands and looked down at the massive, shiny rock on her finger. I continued to force the brutal reality into the open. "It's made entirely of glass, Brooke. It's a worthless piece of polished cubic zirconia. 3 months ago, the very same week he proposed to you, the man standing in front of you walked into a shady pawnshop in the Diamond District. He took the priceless, flawless heirloom ring that your late grandmother entrusted to him for this proposal, and he ruthlessly pried it out of the antique platinum setting. He pawned your family legacy for quick, desperate cash, just to pay the venue deposit for this wedding." Brooke let out a sharp, desperate gasp. She pulled the ring off her finger as if the metal had suddenly scorched her skin. She stared at the fake rock, a profound, heartbroken sense of betrayal washing over her face. She looked up at Trent silently, begging him to deny it, begging him to tell her it was all a misunderstanding. But Trent didn't even dare to look her in the eye. He stared at the floor, his jaw trembling silently, confirming every word I'd just spoken. Patricia let out a loud, theatrical wail, finally understanding that her grand social climb was funded entirely by cheap glass and stolen family heirlooms. She collapsed into a nearby chair, burying her face in her hands. The entire room was in a state of extreme dread, watching this handsome, charming groom being systematically dismantled, exposed as a pathetic, thieving parasite who specialized in preying on the innocent trust of young women. I turned my focus back to Trent. It was time for the final, crushing blow. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, invading his personal space and forcing him to look up at me. He was completely trapped, pinned in place by my looming stature and the collective anger of the gathered guests. "You didn't pawn the ring just to survive," I said, my voice dropping to a lethally low, gravelly whisper with a deadly edge. "You borrowed a full $4 million from an extremely violent syndicate linked to the Russian mob. You were desperate and cowardly. So you didn't use your own name. You committed malicious identity theft. You intentionally leveraged my innocent daughter's highly sensitive social security number as the primary collateral for your illegal IOU. You legally authorized a cartel to drain her generational trust fund entirely in the event of your inevitable default." Trent squeezed his eyes shut, and a single tear of pure, absolute terror traced a path down his pale cheek. His entire body was shaking violently. He knew the penalty for stealing from those specific lenders was extreme. "But your desperate little game ends tonight," I continued, my words hitting him like physical blows. "As of 6 a.m. this morning, my multinational corporation intervened in the shadow market. We purchased that entire debt portfolio through untraceable shell companies. You don't owe the Russian mob a single cent anymore, Trent. You owe me. Your entire miserable life now belongs to me. I am the sole absolute owner of your $4 million IOU, and I am officially demanding repayment of the entire loan. Right now. You have exactly 10 seconds to process this reality before my private security team drags you out of this reception and hands you over directly to federal authorities for massive financial fraud and felony identity theft. Run away like the truly pathetic coward you are. Disappear from my sight, Trent, and never return to my family again." Trent didn't run. His legs went completely limp, unable to support the massive weight of this sudden and absolute destruction. He collapsed onto the cold marble floor of the dance floor, his expensive tailored trousers bunching awkwardly around his knees. The arrogant, untouchable groom who had just smeared cake on my face was gone completely. In his place was a broken, sobbing con artist. He crawled forward on the smooth stone, closing the short distance between us. His hands, still sticky with the vanilla frosting he'd used to humiliate me, reached out desperately. He grabbed the worn leather of my steel-toed boots, clutching them tightly as if they were his only lifeline in a raging storm. Tears streamed down his pale face, mixing with his sweat of extreme panic. "Please, Mr. Cole," Trent begged, his voice breaking into a high-pitched, pathetic whimper that echoed unpleasantly through the quiet reception tent. "Please, I'm begging you. I'll do anything you want. I'll work for you for the rest of my life. I'll be your absolute slave. Just don't destroy me. Don't let them take me away. I can fix this. I can make everything right." I looked down at the man clutching my old boots and weeping. I felt absolutely no pity, only a deep, profound sense of extreme disgust. This was a predator who manipulated my daughter, pawned her grandmother's priceless heirloom, and casually offered her financial future to a violent criminal syndicate, merely to fund his pathetic, grand illusion. I drew my boot back slowly and deliberately, forcing his clutching hands to slide off the worn leather. I stepped back, drawing a physical boundary between my family and his toxic presence. "You cannot fix a foundation built entirely on malicious lies, Trent," I said coldly, my voice steady, completely devoid of any emotion. "You made your choices with absolute arrogance, fully believing you were the smartest man in the room. Now you will face the absolute consequences of those choices." I raised my right hand. I didn't need to shout. I simply snapped my fingers. The sharp, clean sound cut through the heavy silence of the massive tent, like a dry branch snapping. Instantly, the heavy mahogany doors at the main entrance of the reception hall swung wide open. The soft afternoon sunlight flooded the room, outlining the 5 figures marching aggressively down the central aisle. Leading the charge was Vincent. He wore a pristine charcoal suit, and his expression was one of absolute, uncompromising authority. Flanking him on both sides were 4 federal agents in dark tactical jackets, their badges hanging prominently from their belts. The crowd of wealthy socialites scattered instantly, recoiling back toward their decorated tables, to clear a wide path for the approaching officers. The undeniable reality of federal law enforcement entering a billionaire wedding reception triggered a frantic whisper among the elite guests. Vincent stopped exactly 2 feet away from Trent, who remained kneeling on the marble floor. He gave a look of slight disdain toward the broken groom, then turned his respectful gaze entirely toward me. "We have secured the full search and arrest warrants," Vincent stated clearly, handing a stack of heavy official judicial documents to the lead federal agent. "The offshore transfers have been locked, and the identity theft charges have been formally filed with the federal prosecutor." I gave Vincent a firm nod. "Arrest him for felony identity theft, massive wire fraud, and extensive financial conspiracy," I commanded, my voice carrying the absolute weight of a final verdict. The 2 lead agents stepped forward instantly. They grabbed Trent by the lapels of his expensive suit jacket and hauled him up roughly. Trent struggled frantically, his panic finally overriding his physical weakness. "No, wait! Please, you can't do this to me!" Trent screamed hysterically, his voice breaking as cold handcuffs clicked heavily onto his wrists. "Brooke, tell them. Tell your father to stop." But Brooke simply turned her face away, wrapping her arms around her own torso, tears of deep betrayal slipping silently down her beautiful cheeks. The agents didn't hesitate. They turned Trent around and began dragging him roughly like a frog down the long central aisle of the reception tent. Trent kicked and howled, his expensive leather shoes sliding futilely against the polished marble. His desperate, humiliating screams echoed loudly between the beautiful floral arrangements and the crystal chandeliers, providing the perfect, pathetic soundtrack for the total destruction of his fake empire. The crowd watched in shocked, breathless silence as the groom was dragged out of his own grand wedding and shoved forcibly into the back seat of a waiting federal transport van. As the heavy doors slammed shut behind the federal agents, a new frantic energy erupted near the front tables. Patricia finally recovered from her initial state of paralyzed shock. She watched as the man who was supposed to guarantee her entry into high society was dragged away like a common street thief. Her greedy, calculating brain frantically processed this devastating shift in power. In a matter of seconds, she realized that the poor, uneducated mechanic she'd been relentlessly mocking and tormenting all weekend was actually an industry titan whose net worth completely dwarfed her wildest fantasies. She quickly smoothed her expensive silk gown, plastering a sickeningly sweet, entirely artificial smile onto her pale face. She rushed across the dance floor at nearly full speed, heels clicking loudly, and headed straight for me. "Harrison, darling!" Patricia gasped, her voice trembling with her clumsy attempt to project warmth and affection. "My God, this has all been so incredibly overwhelming. Why on earth didn't you tell us your true identity? We could have been so good to you. We could have planned something truly magnificent for you. After all, we're family." I stared deeply into her wide, calculating eyes. I saw pure, undiluted greed churning beneath the surface of her pathetic smile. She didn't care about the profound trauma her daughter had just endured. She didn't care about the massive criminal conspiracy that nearly destroyed our family. All she cared about was the massive wealth she suddenly believed she could somehow acquire. I didn't return the smile. I let the cold, unforgiving reality settle heavily between us. "You don't understand the true definition of family, Patricia," I said, my voice dropping into a stern, resonant tone that completely erased her fake smile. "I gave you exactly what you asked for. I played the exact role you assigned me because it was the only way to expose the absolute truth. You asked me why I didn't tell you about my wealth." My gaze pierced straight through her, letting my disgust show clearly. "Because you only love a wallet, Patricia. You don't love a man. You never have, and you never will." I turned away from her shocked, pale face, stepped over the ruined wedding cake, crossed the dance floor, and finally went to comfort my weeping daughter. The massive reception tent, which just minutes ago had been filled with the chaotic energy of 200 wealthy guests, was now emptying rapidly. Elite socialites and speculative investors were fleeing the scene of the scandal as fast as their expensive shoes could carry them. They whispered in low, terrified voices, desperate to distance themselves from the catastrophic collapse of Trent Caldwell. Waiters in white tuxedo shirts retreated quietly through the swinging kitchen doors, abandoning the trays of expensive champagne and exotic appetizers they'd been holding. Patricia, realizing her grand social masquerade had been utterly destroyed, grabbed her designer handbag and nearly ran toward the valet. She didn't even look back at her own daughter. Within minutes, the grand, astonishing venue was completely abandoned. The string quartet packed up their instruments and vanished. The only sounds left were the coastal wind gently blowing against the heavy canvas of the tent and soft, rhythmic sobbing. I walked slowly across the polished marble dance floor, my steel-toed boots making soft echoes in the vast, empty space. Above, the massive chandeliers cast a warm gold light over the reception, which had been reduced to a total ruin. Brooke sat alone at a massive, empty dining table. Her beautiful white wedding dress fanned out on the floor around her, a stark contrast to the devastating heartbreak written across her face. She wasn't crying because she had lost Trent. She was a very intelligent young woman, and the cruel reality of his deception had shattered any toxic illusion he had built around her. She was crying because of a deep, overwhelming sense of shame. She had watched him shove cake into my face. She had watched her mother belittle me the entire weekend. She had been blind to the monster standing right beside her, and she had watched the person who truly loved her be treated like absolute garbage. I pulled out the chair next to her and sat down. I didn't care that my suit was still stained with vanilla frosting, or that my collar was completely ruined. I just looked at my daughter, waiting for her to find her own voice. She looked up slowly. Her eyes were red and puffy, filled with a sadness that crushed my heart deep down. She looked at me, truly looked at me, seeing me through the cheap clothes and the weather-beaten hands for the first time in years. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling so badly that it was almost impossible to make out the words. "I'm so incredibly sorry. I was so blind. I let them treat you like you weren't even there. I was so wrapped up in the fantasy, the beautiful dress, and the grand venue that I didn't even see what he was. I didn't protect you. I should have stood up for you. I didn't give her a harsh lecture. I didn't remind her of the countless times I had gently tried to warn her about Trent and his vain charm. The cruelty of reality had already taught her the hardest lesson of her life. Instead, I reached out and gently pulled her into a deep, incredibly warm embrace. She buried her face in my shoulder, and she sobbed freely as I held her tightly. I rested my chin on her hair, providing the solid, unshakable foundation she desperately needed in that moment. "I never hid my money to hurt you, Brooke," I said softly, my voice calm, completely devoid of any anger or resentment. "I hid it because I wanted to protect you from people like him. When people know you have massive wealth, they look at you differently. They no longer see a beautiful, intelligent young woman. They start to see an open vault. They manufacture an entire personality just to gain access to your resources. I wanted you to build a life based on sincere connections, not financial exploitation. I wanted you to find someone who loved your heart, not your generational trust fund. Trent was a predator, and predators are extremely skilled at camouflage. You aren't stupid, sweetheart. You were just too trusting, and he used your beautiful, trusting nature as a weapon against you." Brooke slowly pulled away from the embrace, wiping the tear-stained tracks from her face with the back of her hand. She looked down at the empty space on her ring finger. Then she reached out and picked up the small silk clutch resting on the table. She pulled out the massive, shiny engagement ring Trent had placed on her finger, accompanied by countless hollow promises. She stared at the glass stone, a look of profound disgust washing over her face. She reached out and placed the fake ring directly into my palm. "Take it," she whispered, her voice hardening with a new, quiet resolve. "I never want to see it again." I took the worthless piece of glass and slipped it into my pocket. I stood up and reached out my hand to her. "Time to go home, Brooke," I said gently. "The illusion is completely over. It's time to step back into reality." She took my hand, gathered the heavy skirt of her designer gown, and stood up. Together we walked away from the empty tables, the shattered crystal, and the ruined cake. We walked out of the grand fake palace Trent had built with stolen money and forged signatures. The warm coastal sunset began to dip below the horizon, casting brilliant shades of orange and purple across the sky. The manicured lawn was completely deserted. We walked past the empty valet stand and headed straight for the service parking lot. My old rusted pickup truck sat exactly where I'd left it that morning. Against the backdrop of the massive stone estate, it looked completely out of place, but to me, it was absolutely perfect. I opened the heavy passenger side door. The hinges gave a loud creak in the quiet evening air. Brooke climbed in, her expensive wedding dress filling the worn, cracked vinyl seat. I closed her door firmly, walked around the front of the rusted hood, and climbed into the driver's seat. I inserted the key into the ignition and turned it. The aged, powerful V8 engine roared to life with a low rumble that shook the entire frame of the truck. In that quiet, desolate parking lot, the loud, unfiltered mechanical roar sounded like a victory cry. We pulled out of the service entrance and drove down the coastal highway, leaving the lies, the fraud, and the shallow world of Patricia and Trent far behind. The months following that explosive wedding day were a period of intense, necessary healing for my daughter. We spent a lot of time together, simply sitting on the porch of my quiet home, drinking coffee and rebuilding our relationship from the ground up, away from Trent's toxic influence or Patricia's suffocating vanity. Brooke finally began to rediscover her true self. She started working with me at Cole Enterprises, starting from the very bottom to learn the actual mechanics of our global operations. She realized that true success isn't found in rented sports cars or fake diamond rings. It is built through quiet dedication, unwavering integrity, and genuine hard work. She learned how to manage her trust fund responsibly, establishing strict legal boundaries to ensure she would never be vulnerable to another financial predator. As for Trent Caldwell, the federal justice system dismantled his entire existence. The evidence we provided was overwhelming. He faced multiple federal counts of massive wire fraud, felony identity theft, and criminal conspiracy. The violent syndicate he tried to borrow from was also subjected to a harsh investigation, leading to a massive crackdown on their illegal lending operations. Trent was sentenced to 15 years in a federal prison. In his new reality, there are no designer suits or expensive champagne. He is finally forced to face the absolute, undeniable consequences of his extreme arrogance. Patricia, humiliated by the sheer scale of the public torture, quietly moved to another state, unable to face her former social circle after her complete financial and moral bankruptcy was exposed to the world. If you're listening to this story right now, I hope you walk away with a profound, unshakable understanding of the world. Predators don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they wear tailored suits, drive expensive cars, and say everything you want to hear. They prey on kindness. They manipulate trust. They use surface-level charm to cloud your judgment of their true intentions. You must always protect your peace, your identity, and your resources. Never let anyone pressure you into making a commitment in a rush, and never ignore the quiet, persistent warning in your gut. True value isn't measured by a price tag on a venue or the size of a diamond. True value is measured by respect, honesty, and the willingness of someone to stand by you when the whole world falls apart. If you enjoyed this story and found value in the hard-won lessons we learned, please take a moment to engage with this video. Click the like button now to support the channel and help these important stories reach more people who desperately need to hear them. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming life stories. Please make sure to turn on your notifications. I would absolutely love to hear from you in the comments section below. Please tell me exactly where you are watching this from today, what time it is in your city, and what you would have done if you were in my shoes. Have you ever encountered someone who tried to manipulate you for their own financial gain? Sharing your experiences helps build a strong, supportive community where we can all learn and grow together. Your engagement means the world to me. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for taking the time to listen, for offering your support, and for standing with me. Stay safe, trust your gut, and I will see you in our next life story. With love and deep respect. The greatest deception in life isn't a fake smile or a rented car. It's the belief that wealth defines a person's worth. True power doesn't shout from the rooftops, nor does it demand a seat at the front of the table. It sits quietly in the back, observes, calculates, and protects the ones it loves. Never judge a man by the dirt on his boots or the age of his suit, because the quietest man often holds the keys to the kingdom. Respect everyone, because arrogance eventually digs a grave your wallet cannot fill. If this story showed you the true meaning of strength and respect, click the like button and subscribe immediately. Leave a comment below telling me where you are watching from, and if you've ever dealt with a fake, arrogant person. I read every single comment. See you next time.